are now for the fifth Sunday of the Lenten time. The season of Lent is moving along quite quickly when you think about it. And the readings today, the first reading comes from the book of the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. A couple of verses there. The second reading comes from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 5, verses 7 through 9. And the gospel reading comes from John's Gospel, chapter 12, verses 20 through 33. So, as we have been looking at things during this Lenten time, you remember that I suggested that the first reading, usually from the Old Testament, has something to do with covenants. And we've looked at some of the major covenants that God is pictured as establishing with people. First week, the covenant with Noah, remember, the great flood. The second week, the covenant with Abraham, of course, and then his family. The third week, the covenant with Israel, the Sinai covenant, and Moses giving the commandments. Then last week, one of the prophets reminding us that the commandments, the covenant treaty or agreement that Israel had made with God was not always being kept, and that hopefully they would return and come back to that covenant. Well, now this week, the fifth Sunday, we, as Jeremiah will present things, talks about a new covenant, that I will write a new covenant not on the tablets of stone, but on the fleshy tablets of the heart. Now, this little section, chapter 30 through 31, in Jeremiah's work is known as the Book of Comfort. So within the larger work, there are little sections, and that's what these two chapters and verses are called by those who look at these things. Jeremiah is, of course, a traditional prophet. We've mentioned before that he is the prophet who has a long ministry with the Hebrew people. Estimates are that Jeremiah's prophet role extended over 40 years, and that he was a prophet at the time that the city of Jerusalem was taken and leveled to the ground by the armies of Babylon. He was present with the Judeans, and were the group that basically were involved in the event that took place in 586 before the common time, and went off into exile with the Hebrew people. But he also envisions a time when this exile will end, that it is not forever, that because of the events that took place, yes, they lost control of their land. Yes, they lost control of the beautiful temple that had been built by Solomon. Mentioned that this in one of our earlier talks, had been burned to the ground, and that the city of Jerusalem, for all intended purposes, had also been destroyed. Now, I just mentioned the city of Jerusalem. Please, when you think of the city of Jerusalem, just as a contemporary, think more the size of the village of Lancaster. So when they talk about a city, they're not talking about a city the size of Buffalo, as it is today, but is a much smaller place. And for that reason, the temple took up a significant part of that city. See, so that I just mentioned this in passing, that sizes of cities, if you really want to make them great, well, you add numbers, but in fact, probably was not quite as big as cities now in our time are. Now, he talks about the fact, that is the prophet, that he is going to, that is God, is going to write a new tablet, a new and the tablet here, in this case, becomes the heart. Now, I think it's important here because Christians, of course, have taken this passage of Isaiah, and we've given it our own interpretation. But in fairness to Jeremiah and to the Hebrew Bible, when Jeremiah says, I am going to write a new covenant on the fleshy tablets of the heart, he was not denegating the commandments or the covenants that had gone before. So sometimes Christians, when using the word new, have suggested, well, new as opposed to old. And I've mentioned this earlier on in our discussions, that there's a certain bias that is given to new, tending to think that new is better, buy a new car, whether an old car. New washing machine is better than the old washing machine. New vacuum cleaner is better than an old vacuum cleaner. The only time that old is better is wine. Old wine is better than new wine. But isn't there a kind of prejudice toward new as opposed to old? Well, that's all right, but keep in mind here that this new covenant that's going to be written on the fleshy hearts of the believer does not negate or denegate the Torah or the law. What the prophet is really speaking to fellow Hebrews is saying, yes, we will still have the external commandments, and they will be kept on scrolls and kept in special places. But what is going to be more important is that this covenant of God will be taken inward, will be written on our hearts. So the law of Sinai is still what Jeremiah has in mind. Now, I mention this because, as I say, Christians take Jeremiah's words and say, oh, the new commandment, the new covenant is Jesus. And that's fair enough to say. It's a Christian interpretation of Jeremiah's words here. But this has given rise to, here's a nickel word for you, what was called supersessionism. Namely, that somehow once Jesus comes, the old is no longer necessary. See, new as opposed to old. So the old is out and the new is in. That's important for Christians. But I think we need to be a little careful that that's not how the Hebrew generation or community interprets these words of Jeremiah. But also what is important in the words of Jeremiah here is that he extends this sense of the knowledge of God to not just one group of people, but gives it a universal message. It is something which is to be shared and to be written and to be understood by everyone. There is a danger here over the centuries of what turns out to be what we might call religious wars, where one religion sees themselves as having the lock on the truth, and they will not tolerate others. And unfortunately, we have seen this, and we continue to see it, do we not, even in our own time, that therefore there's only one way in which God's law can be written in the hearts of people. Well, when we think about it, put it like that, you say, well, no, God can do it in different ways. And that's perhaps important to notice. Where will this new commandment be written? On the heart. Now, those of you who are into physiology know what the heart is, that it's a muscle, and that it really keeps the blood moving, and if the heart stops, the blood stops moving, we're finished, okay? But keep in mind that in biblical language, the heart is the center of everything. It is the center of feeling, it is the center of knowledge, it is the center of all activity. See, so as we have grown up, and I think that's probably the truth of the matter, is we think of knowledge being up here in the head, and somehow emotion, and unfortunately even emotionalism, is with the heart. Well, that may be the way we think of things, but when the scripture speaks of the heart, it is the center of the person, where all of the activities that make us who we are take place. And sometimes, even today, do we not use that phrase to get to the heart of the matter? What is really the center? What is really that around which everything else works? So I mention this, will probably not be part of the homily that we'll hear this weekend, but that for the Hebrew community, Jeremiah's words of writing a new covenant does not, as I said, negate the Torah or the law, but really simply hopes that all who hear it will internalize it at the same time that it externally can be seen. The prophet pictures a world, and it's a wonderful vision here that he has, that is Jeremiah, of a world without sin. And that challenges the credibility even today of such a world. And yet that is, if we can use this, the utopian vision of Jeremiah, a time in which all will be truly well, where there will not be sin. Of course, you remember that Hebrew word means to miss the mark, to miss the mark, that there will come a time when we won't, like a target, miss the mark, but will hit it exactly, the heart of the matter. So it's a beautiful vision that Jeremiah sees of a new covenant. Yes, it will be a covenant, but will be kind of understood and lived in a much more generous, universal, global manner. Will it ever really happen? Well, we can only hope for that, can't we, okay? But as the prophet says, covenants are grounded not in fear or obedience in the sense that if you don't do it, something terrible is going to happen, but in the sense that covenants, unfortunately, have never really truly worked. And if they truly worked, there would be no fear, but there would only be understanding and love. As a writer, I put this down here, George Benton, who is a jazz artist, has recently said, "Mysteries do unfold, nothing and no one goes unchanged." So the purpose of the covenant that Jeremiah has means is that there will be a change, because the heart is always a living experience, whereas tablets of stone, well, it can't change too much, see? So that's the vision of the prophet Jeremiah. Now moving to the gospel. The gospel today jumps to the 12th chapter of John, and it begins by a group of Greeks, we don't know how many Greeks there were, but Greeks come to Philip and Andrew and ask the question, can we see Jesus? Now, much discussion takes place around the word, the Greeks. Some translations of the Bible translate the Greeks as Gentiles. That's probably not what is in mind here. What we really find is you have a group of Greek-speaking or Hellenic Jews coming to Andrew and Philip. Now, what do we know about Andrew and Philip? Well, you may guess that Andrew and Philip are Greek names. Of the 12 apostles, these two bear Greek names, but they're still Jewish. So we've mentioned this before, that what's known as Hellenic Judaism was very prevalent in the first century world, and probably a number of those who accepted Jesus' teaching were from that background. The fourth Gospel of John always is talking about what goes on in a Jewish experience. Now, that's important. And so here you have Hellenic Jews interested in Jesus, and the gospel writer says, or pictures Jesus as saying, "My hour has come." In the fourth gospel, it's all around the hour of Jesus. And what is the hour of Jesus? Well, we've alluded to this last time. The hour of Jesus is that moment when he is lifted up on the cross and exalted on the cross. And then I will draw all things to myself. So the hour of Jesus has now come. One remembers early on in the gospel at Cana, when Mary had said, they don't have enough wine, Jesus says, well, my hour isn't yet. Well, some say that kind of began to trigger it, but in the gospel writer's viewpoint, this is now the hour for the Son of Man. So why would Philip and Andrew be the right people? Well, see, they bore the kind of name, they kind of were interceders, if you want, for bringing them to Jesus. We never really know, why I hesitate here, we would never really know whether they get to see Jesus, because at this point, Jesus now engages in a dialogue. It's interesting that as Jesus says, "My hour is now coming," makes an allusion to a agricultural image. It's perhaps a short little, what we would call parable, which reads, and we'll find this in the reading for this week, "Unless a grain fall into the ground and die, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it comes to life." Well, you can see here the imagery of what Jesus is about to engage. He will die, but will come to new life. So, and there is a certain reality here that the seed must die. If the seed does not die, it remains just a seed, and it ultimately has no purpose or value. But if it dies, when it's placed into the ground, it then creates and comes to new life. So that's a very little parable, but kind of beautiful. And pictures of a phrase that we will hear later on, especially when we come to the Easter season, that one must lay down one's life for one's brother or love of others. So that takes place. Now, as this hour of Jesus is about to begin, we get an interesting thought that Jesus is troubled at the prospect of the suffering that is about to take place. Now, often we just think, oh, Jesus knew everything, and therefore, like water off the duck's back. No, that here, now in the synoptic tradition, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the words that we hear right now appear when Jesus is in the garden at Gethsemane. Later on, in the gospel narration of Jesus' passion and death, the fourth gospel does not mention any agony in the garden. But here, the similar words are spoken by Jesus. The hour is coming, and I'm troubled. I wish I would not have to do this. So it's interesting that in the midst of teaching about Jesus, once again, a little bit, John brings to our attention the humanness of Jesus, realizing that what's about to happen, Jesus kind of would, maybe is there a way around it? Maybe I wouldn't have to do this, see? And so he says he's troubled at the prospect of suffering to happen. Now, did Jesus want to die on the cross? Did the Father set Jesus up to die on the cross? I think it's important maybe to step back a moment and to say, let's answer that question by saying no. Did Jesus kind of know that the world was closing in on him and that he might be really subject to kind of terrible pains and trials? Yes, because he had done enough to disturb those in positions of leadership to challenge him. See? So I suggest that Jesus knew by using common sense that they were out to get him, and that if he continued the course of what he was doing, taking the stances that he was taking, that they would move against him. They would not let this go unchallenged. So in that sense, did Jesus know? Well, did he know for sure? Well, that we can't answer. But that it doesn't take too much to put two and two together if you continue to challenge. And notice how often Jesus, in John's gospel, but even in the other gospels, challenges the authorities. And there's only so long that you can challenge the authority before they close in on you. There's a truth of life. And that, did God want this to happen to Jesus? No, but the fact that he did, that he stayed the course, that he failed to be giving up on the mission of the kingdom is what's important here. And so now, in a gospel in which what we call signs are very important, a sign is now given. All of this happens. We're not quite sure where this is happening, by the way. Remember that Jesus is teaching. The Greeks come and say, we want to see Jesus. This whole kind of little scenario takes place. But exactly where it's taking place is not given by the gospel writer, okay? Jesus now will picture that if this isn't going to pass, then I will take the course. And the sign, now a sign is given. What happens? It's interesting. There's like thunder. And the people who were around said, where's this thunder coming from? But a voice comes out of the heavens and reassures that Jesus is doing the right thing. This is a sign that will be important later on because Jesus will not ask his disciples to do anything that he himself hasn't done. So the Father, this is what happens. An interesting scene, isn't it? That the Father speaks out of the heavens. Where has this happened before? Well, we've seen in other places where this is my beloved Son, words articulated by the voice from heaven, which of course is the Father. The reading says that the voice is like thunder, okay? So then those who interpret this say, well, who is the voice? Is this an angel speaking, okay? Is this God speaking? There are elements here of what happened at Mount Sinai. Remember earlier on we mentioned where the commandments are given and where God speaks out of the cloud to Moses and even on one occasion to the people. So all of that, and I mention this quite regularly, an understanding of Judaism and the customs and practices of Judaism in Jesus' time are very important for appreciating particularly the fourth gospel, the gospel according to John. So verse 33, which is one of the verses here, which is the last verse of those that we will be hearing, he speaks of being lifted up. Now remember, we mentioned, and that's why last week's reading comes to mind. Remember that when Jesus was with Nicodemus, the words had been, when I am lifted up, I will draw all things to myself. Well, now that idea of being lifted up is again brought to our attention. And here, the lifting up again reflects the importance of Jesus' death, by crucifixion, but also his exaltation, when he will truly be seen as who he is, the divine Son of God, the one through whom God brings into this world something important and new. Whoever serves me, the Father will honor, says Jesus. And that's important too, that they will remember that as Jesus accepts now, and that's what's important to see here, Jesus accepts the will of the Father. We sometimes, especially with John's Gospel, tend to place a great deal of emphasis on the divineness of Jesus. But I would suggest that when one looks again, this particular Gospel presents a very human picture of Jesus. You remember a section that we haven't looked at this year, but we did, I think, last year, where when Martha and Mary tell Jesus that their brother Lazarus has died, that Jesus is pictured as crying because he loved him. There are very human moments in the story of Jesus as remembered by John. So although all these other kind of events take place around him, I think it's a kind of beautiful and important image to keep in mind that Jesus, like us, if he could, would have avoided suffering. I don't think anybody, I shouldn't say anybody, likes to suffer. There are those who kind of use that as a way sometimes to get your attention. But nobody really likes to suffer. And we will take the appropriate measures to avoid it or diminish it, except if you're that exception. So even Jesus here would like a different course to take place, but because of what he has done and because what he will continue to do, he will embrace whatever is going to happen. So one can see, by the way, that this particular gospel prepares us now. This is the next week will be Palm Sunday, and then, of course, Easter Sunday. So we are moving very quickly toward Holy Week and toward those events that certainly are important in the story of Jesus, known as the Paschal Mysteries. And so this is a good gospel and a good set of readings for helping us get ready for what is coming up. Just a brief word about a passage in the second reading to Hebrews. This perhaps is the clearest New Testament picture of Jesus suffering as one of us. So it goes to a point I just made, that in the days of his flesh, Jesus suffered. So, and he once, says this little passage that we will hear, was made perfect by the obedience he learned from what he had suffered. So indeed, sometimes we think of Jesus just doing everything, well, because he was. No, he, like us, learned through suffering how to do the very best to carry out God's will and God's wish. And for that reason, the writer to the Hebrews says, Christ has become the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. So this little section from the Hebrew letter is perhaps a very important one, especially now as we move toward the remembrance of Jesus' suffering and death. So thank you very much for being with us, and hope to see you